to like and subscribe for more videos like this.
We're continuing to read and relax with excerpts from How It Works by Archibald Williams, a book available on Project Gutenberg. We pick up with compound locomotives, of which, from the collection, the Western Maryland Scenic Engine 1309 is a compound mallet engine. So we'll run that in the background while we read and relax. In 1876, Mr. A. Mallet introduced compounding in locomotives, and the practice has been largely adopted. The various types of compounds may be classified as follows. 1. One low-pressure and one high-pressure cylinder. 2. One high-pressure and two low-pressure. 3. One low-pressure and two high-pressure. And 4. Two high-pressure and two low-pressure. The last class is used widely in France, America, and Russia, and seems to give the best results. Where only 2 cylinders are used, and sometimes in the case of 3 or 4, a valve arrangement permits the admission of high-pressure steam to both high and low-pressure cylinders for starting a train or moving it up heavy grades. The engines of a locomotive or steamship must be reversible, that is, when steam is admitted to the cylinders, the engineer must be able to do so directly and direct it through the steamways that the cranks may turn in the desired direction. The commonest form of reversing device, invented by George Stephenson, is known as Stephenson's link gear. In Figure 30, we have a diagrammatic presentation of this gear. E1 and E2 are 2 eccentrics set square with the crank at opposite ends of a diameter. Their rods are connected to the ends of a link, L, which can be raised and lowered by means of levers, not shown. B is a block which can partly revolve on a pin projecting from the valve rod. Working through a guide, G. In Figure 31, the link is half raised or in mid-gear, as drivers say. Eccentric E1 has pushed the lower end of the link fully back. E2 has pulled it fully forward, and since any movement of the one eccentric is counterbalanced by the opposite movement of the other, rotation of the eccentrics would not cause the valve to move at all, and no steam could be admitted to the cylinder. Let us suppose that Figure 30 denotes one cylinder, crank, rods, etc. of a locomotive. The crank has come to rest at its half stroke. The reversing lever is at the mid-gear notch. If the engineer desires to turn his cranks in an anti-clockwise direction, he raises the link, which brings the rod of E1 into line with the valve rod and presses the block backwards till the right-hand port is uncovered. If steam is now admitted, the piston will be pushed toward the left, and the engine will continue to run in an anti-clockwise direction. If, on the other hand, he wants to run the engine the other way, he would drop the link, bringing the rod of E2 into line with the valve rod and drawing V forward to uncover the rear port. In either case, the eccentric working the end of the link remote from B has no effect, since it merely causes the end to describe arcs of circles of which B is the center. Linking up. If the link is only partly lowered or raised from the central position, it still causes the engine to run accordingly, but the movement of the valve is decreased. When running at high speed, an engineer links up his reversing gear, causing his valves to cut off early in the stroke, and the steam to work more expansively than it could with the lever at full or end gear, so that this device not only renders an engine reversible, but also gives the engineer an absolute command over the expansion ratio of the steam admitted to the cylinder, and furnishes a method of cutting off the steam altogether. In Figures 30, 31, and 32, the valve has no lap at the eccentrics are set square. In actual practice, the valve faces would have lap, and the eccentric lead to correspond, but for the sake of simplicity, neither is shown. Other gears. In the Gooch gear for reversing locomotives, the link does not shift, but the valve rod and its block is raised or lowered. The Allen gear is so arranged that when the link is also raised, the block is lowered, and vice versa. There are really only modifications of Stephenson's principle, namely, the employment of 2 eccentrics set at equal angles to and on opposite sides of the crank. There are 3 other forms of link reversing gears and nearly a dozen types of radial reversing devices, But as we have already described the three most commonly used on locomotives and ships, there is no need to give these particulars. Before the introduction of Stephenson's gear, a single eccentric was used for each cylinder, and to reverse the engine, this eccentric had to be loose on the axle. A lever and gear worked by treadle on the footplate controlled by the position of the eccentrics. When starting the engine, the driver put the eccentrics out of gear by the treadle. Then, by means of a lever, he raised the small ends of the eccentric rods, and noting the position of the cranks, or if more convenient, the balance weight in the wheels, he, by means of another handle, moved the valves to open the necessary ports to the steam and worked them by hand until the engine was moving. Then, with the treadle, he threw the eccentrics over the engaged the studs, at the same time dropping the small ends of the rods to engage pins upon the valve spindles, so that they continue to keep up the movement of the valve. One would imagine that in modern shunting yards, such a device would somewhat delay operations. Piston valves. In marine engines and on many locomotives and some stationary engines, the D valve, shown in Figure 30 and 32, is replaced by a piston valve or circular valve, working up and down in tubular seating. It may be best described as a rod carrying two pistons, which correspond to the faces of a D valve. Instead of rectangular ports that are opened in the tube in which the piston valve moves, communicating with the steamways into the cylinder and with the exhaust pipe. In the case of the D valve, the pressure above it is much greater than that below, and considerable friction arises if the rubber faces are not kept well lubricated. The piston valve gets over this difficulty, since such steam may leak past it, presses on its circumference at all points equally. Speed governors. Practically all engines, except locomotives and those known as donkey engines, used on cranes, are fitted with some device for keeping the rotary speed of the crank constant within very narrow limits. Perhaps you have seen a pair of balls moving round on a seat over the boiler of a threshing engine. They form part of the governor, or speed controller, shown in principle in Figure 33. A belt driven by a pulley on the crankshaft turns a small pulley P at the foot of the governor. This transmits motion through two bevel wheels, G, to a vertical shaft, from the top of which hangs two heavy balls on links, K, K. Two more links, L, L, connect the balls with a weight, W, which has a deep groove cutting round at the bottom. When the shaft revolves, the balls fly outwards by centrifugal force, and as their velocity increases, the quadrilateral figure contained by the four links expands laterally and shortens vertically. The angles between KK and LL become less and less obtuse, and the weight W is drawn upwards, bringing with it the fork C of the rod A, which is ends engaging with the groove. As C rises, the other end of the rod is depressed, and the rod B depresses rod O, which is attached to the spindle operating a sort of shutter in the steam pipe. Consequently, the steam supply is throttled more and more as the speed increases, until it has been so reduced that the engine slows and the balls fall, opening the valve again. Figure 34 shows the valve fully closed. This form of governor was invented by James Watt. A spring is often used instead of a weight, and the governor is arranged horizontally so that it may be driven directly from the crankshaft without the intervention of bevel gearing. The Hartwell governor employs a link motion. You must here picture the balls raising and lowering the free end of the valve rod, which carries a block moving in a link connected with the eccentric rod. The link is pivoted at the upper end, and the eccentric rod is attached to the lower. When the engine is at rest, the engine of the valve rod and its block are dropped till in a line with the eccentric rod. But when the machinery begins to work, the block is gradually drawn up by the governor, diminishing movement of the valve, and so shortening the period of steam admission to the cylinder. Governors are of special importance when the load of an engine is consistently varying, as in the case of a sawmill. A good governor will limit variation of speed within 2%. That is, if the engine is set to run at 100 revolutions a minute, it will not allow it to exceed 101 or fall below 99. In very high-speed engines, the governing will prevent variation of less than 1%, even when the load is at one instant full on and the next taken completely off. Marine governors. These must be more quick-acting than those used on engines provided with flywheels, which prevents very sudden variations of speed. The screw is light in proportion to the engine power, and when it is suddenly raised from the water by the pitch of the vessel, The engine would race till the screws took the water again, unless some regulating mechanism were provided. Many types of marine governors have been tried. The most successful seems to be one in which water is being constantly forced by a pump, driven off the engine shaft into a cylinder controlling a throttle valve in the main steam pipe. The water escapes through a leak, which is adjustable. As long as the speed of the engine is normal, the water escapes from the cylinder as fast as it is pumped, and no movement of the piston results. When the screws begin to race, the pump overcomes the leak, and the piston is driven out, causing the throttling of steam supply. Condensers. The condenser serves two purposes. One, it makes it possible to use the same water over and over again in layers. On the sea, where fresh water is not obtainable in large quantities, this is a matter of the greatest importance. It adds to the power, number two, of a compound engine by exerting a back pull on the piston of the lower pressure at cylinder while the steam is being exhausted. Figure 35 is a sectional illustration of a marine condenser. Steam enters the condenser through the large pipe area and passes along a number of very thin copper tubes through which seawater is kept circulating by a pump. The path of the water is shown in the featherless arrows. It comes from the pump through pipe A into the lower part of a large cap covering one end of the condenser and divided transversely by a diaphragm B. Passing through the pipes, it reaches the cap attached to the other end and flows back through the upper tubes to the outlet C. This arrangement ensures that, as the steam condenses, it shall meet colder and colder tubes and finally be turned to water, which passes to the well for the outlet F. In some condensers, the positions of steam and water are reversed, steam going through the tubes outside while cold water circulates. Chapter 3. The Steam Turbine. More than 2,000 years ago, Hero of Alexandria produced the first apparatus to which the name steam engine could rightly be given. Its principle was practically the same as that of the revolving jet used to sprinkle lawns during dry weather, steam being used in place of water. From the top of a closed cauldron rose two vertical pipes, which at their upper end had short, right-angled bends. Between them was hung a hollow globe, pivoting on two short tubes, projecting from its sides into the upper tubes. Two little L-shaped pipes projected from the opposite side of the globe at the end of the diameter, in a plane perpendicular to the axis. On fire being applied to the cauldron, steam was generated. It passed up through the upright, through the pivots, and into the globe, from which it escaped by two L-shaped nozzles, causing rapid revolution of the ball. In short, the first steam engine was a turbine. Curiously enough, we have reverted to this primitive type, scientifically developed, of course, in the most modern engineering practices. How a turbine works. In reciprocating, that is cylindrical, engine steam is admitted into a chamber and the door shut behind it, as it were. As it struggles to expand, it forces out one of the confining walls. The work. In Hero's toy, the impact of the issuing molecules against other molecules that have already emerged from the pipes was used. One may compare the reaction to that exerted by a thrown stone on the thrower. If the thrower is standing on skates, the reaction of the stone will cause him to glide backwards, just as if he had pushed off from some fixed object. In the case of the reaction, namely the Hero type, turbine, the nozzle from which the steam and water issues, moves, along with bodies to which it may be attached. In action turbines, steam is let through fixed nozzles and steamways, and the momentum of the steam is brought to bear on the surface of one of the bodies connected to the shaft. The de Laval turbine. In the earliest form, this turbine was a modification of Hero's. The wheels were merely a pipe bent in an S form. Attached at its center to a hollow vertical shaft supplied the steam through the stuffing box at one extremity. The steam blew out tangentially from the end of the S, causing the shaft to revolve rapidly and work the machinery, usually a cream separator, mounted on it. This motor provided and proved to be very suitable for dairy work, but was too wasteful of steam to be used where high power was needed. In the de Laval turbine, as now constructed, the steam is blown from stationary nozzles against vanes mounted on revolving wheels. Figure 36 shows the nozzles and a turbine wheel. The wheel is made in a solid disc, to the circumference of which the vanes are dovetailed separately in a single row. Each vane is of curved section, the concave side directly toward the nozzles, which, as will be gathered from the transparent specimen on the right of our illustration, gradually expand toward the mouth. This is to allow the expansion of the steam and a consequent gain of velocity. As it issues, each molecule strikes against the concave face of a vein and, while changing its direction, is robbed of its kinetic energy, which passes to the wheel to turn once more to a stone-throwing comparison. It is as if a boy were pelting the wheel with an enormous number of tiny stones. Now, escaping high-pressure steam moves very fast indeed. To give figures, if it enters the small end of the Laval nozzle at 200 pounds per square inch, it will leave the big end at a velocity of 48 miles per minute. That is, at a speed which would take it right round the world in 8.5 hours. The wheel itself would not move at more than about 1/3 of this speed as a maximum. But even so, it may take as many as 30,000 revolutions per minute. A mechanical difficulty is now encountered, namely, that arising from vibration. No matter how carefully the turbine wheel may be balanced, it is practically impossible to make its center of gravity coincide exactly with the center point of the shaft. In other words, the wheel will be a bit, perhaps only a tiny fraction of an ounce, heavier on one side than the other. This one of truth causes vibration, which at the high speed mentioned would cause the shaft to knock the bearings in which it revolves to pieces. If, and this is the point, those bearings were close to the wheel, M. de Laval mounted to the wheel on a shaft long enough between the bearings to whip or bend a little, and the difficulty was surmounted. The normal speed of the turbine wheel is too high for direct drive of some machinery, so it reduced by means of gearing. To dynamos, pumps, and air fans, it is often coupled direct. And that's our installment. We'll pick up next with the Parsons turbine. Thanks for listening, and may you relax.